first we have Luke Turnick, and he's going to be talking to us about masculinity, which I said was a really interesting angle. So, hope you enjoy.
So, as stated, I'm Luke Turnock. I am actually in criminology, so I'll apologise in advance. I might be a bit light on the theory, but I'm hoping the data that I present is going to be of interest to the Gender Studies Symposium. I am going to be talking about variable archetypes and masculinities within gym-going subcultures and gym spaces and how these spaces reflect these archetypes of masculinity. So the gym is a diverse cultural landscape. Gym goers are made up of a large variety of different subcultures which all have different reasons for training, different beliefs regarding training, but they're all framed by this idea of the masculine. They're all motivated by some idealized conception of masculinity. So in my doctoral thesis, I was exploring the drug use of these subcultures, particularly anabolic steroids, and how their different subcultural beliefs and attitudes affected the manner in which they used steroids. And I framed it from the hardcore competitive-oriented to the more hedonic, image-oriented, who were more motivated by access to sex, intimidating other males, etc. And what I realized was essentially this same framework could be applied to the masculine conceptions of these different subcultures. So the aim of my presentation today is just to review the different masculine archetypes found essentially at either end of this spectrum of use and explore how they vary and what they say about perceptions of masculinity within these subcultures. So, as I stated, there's a spectrum of behaviours between the hardcore and the hedonic users, and what we find is there's really a frame by which powerlifters are on one end of this spectrum. We have what's termed lad culture on the other, which is very much about nightclubs and very much about showing off the physicality. And then between these two poles we have such subcultures as bodybuilders and CrossFit, which I won't be focusing on so much today simply for time's sake. But as stated, there's this idea of they're all training for a perception of what it is to be a man. They're training because they want to be more manly by their conception. So exploring their training methods and their symbols will give us an idea of these masculine archetypes. And as I've noted at the bottom, the most clear examples are the powerlifters on one end and the lad culture on the other. So those are the two I'm going to focus on today. So lad culture. Lad culture has a training that's focused on sexual access, sexual competitiveness, being more responsive for women. I should just note, I particularly was looking at heterosexual subcultures in my research. Obviously there is a large gay community that trains in gyms. That wasn't the focus of my particular research. So I'm framing this from a heterosexual perspective. So sexual access and competitiveness, but also homosocial bonding, what's sort of termed lads time in the gym, and ultimately the masculine dominance hierarchy is very related to violent actions. So I think that's significant. So I've got 3 quotes from my research that sort of highlight these 3 elements, and these are all from members of lad culture. So the first is suggesting training's coming because summer in Ibiza is coming, that's the goal, to attract females, for girls to look and go, you're massive, can I touch you? So that's the first motivation he points out. He also notes, time in the gym, you're spending it with your mates, ain't you? You've got your mates, you're hanging out, it's your free time, what you do to relax. So again, that element of homosocial bonding to this subculture, this community. And finally, particularly the key term alpha male. They very definitely frame themselves as being in a form of masculine competition, wherein you have perceptions of the alpha male and the beta male, and if they're fighting, then it's deciding who is the alpha male. And this is all very conscious, which you might expect this to be more of a subconscious trend throughout these types of subcultures. Actually, they're very aware that that is what they're doing, explicit competition. So, as I've noted, these are the key features of this archetype of masculinity within the hedonic end of the spectrum. In terms of sex, sexual access, their training is very image-oriented. So it's all about having a physique to show off. So they'll use drugs that will keep their body fat very low, what are termed rippers, clenbuterol, so they have the visible six-pack, the bicep veins and so on. And there's a lot of taking of gym selfies. You'll see guys in the gym taking off their shirts or lifting their shirts to get a picture of their abs in the gym in front of everyone. Again, we can tie that into dominance. There's sort of peacocking, if you will, showing off in front of other men. The element of homosocial bonding, they tend to train in groups, which isn't so much the case for other subcultures. Powerlifters, which I'll come to next, they tend to have a training partner and they'll train together, and that's very much a motivational thing. Lad culture, it's more, we're all training as a big group, 4 or 5, so that we're bonding at the same time as we're training in the gym. And I've got an example of the type of banter that goes on in these groups. Where one says, I want to be as big as Ryan, and the other replies, well, take this then you'll be as big as him, then till then you're going to be a little weed. So again, this idea of the alpha male, beta male hierarchy, there's one is trying to diminish the other, because that, in their conception, makes him more masculine and the other less so. In terms of the language usage, I've noted it's quite interesting. There's a lot of use of this sort of homophobic language, referring to, oh, that's gay, or calling someone the F word. And it's interesting to frame this using Anderson's theories of inclusive masculinity and wonder, is this a deliberate compensation because under an orthodox conception of masculinity, an obsession with image would be considered feminine, or is this more indicative of just a cultural shift? And there's other elements that Anderson explored within this group. For example, Anderson talks about the idea of trains, sexual practice that occurs within lad culture, which again sort of goes against the orthodox conception of masculinity, but very much shows the masculine archetype to which these groups are aspiring. And then finally, this idea of violence. As I said, this group really stands out from the other gym-going subcultures in their approach to violence. You have fighters training in gyms who don't seem to have such a focus on this idea of violence makes you the alpha male, because they conduct their violence in a very competitive, controlled environment, whereas within lad culture, it's tied to binge drinking, nights out, and getting in fights with strangers. So it's a very different approach. So even though you could ultimately say both are examples of this sort of form of masculinity to which they're aspiring, it varies very much depending on the subcultures. And as I've noted at the bottom, this is really in stark contrast to powerlifters who are very critical of both violence and of drinking, because they feel it interferes with their training goals. And that gives us an idea of what the motivations of powerlifters are, and thus what the masculine archetype is for this subculture. Excuse me. So, powerlifters are primarily motivated by sporting competitiveness, and the sport of powerlifting is essentially a sport of who can lift the biggest amount of weight. They do a squat, a bench press, and a deadlift, so these are all strength-oriented activities. And essentially, what it boils down to is within this subculture, whoever is the strongest male, as in can lift the most weight, is sort of the alpha male. And this might vary depending on, well, two guys are very close in what they lift, but one is on a lot of steroids and the other one isn't so much. That might change it from a strict conception, but overall it does seem to be based on this really obvious, overt competitive hierarchy that we are in this sport. Whoever is better at this sport is whoever's strongest, therefore whoever's strongest is sort of the dominant male in every scenario. And that will be in terms of men seeking advice from them, or how they frame interactions with other men, talk down towards them, etc. So it's less overt, it's not the same banter that we saw for the lad culture, but it's indicative of a masculine hierarchy nonetheless. There's also a strong discipline within this subculture that essentially prevents defection from an orthodox conception of masculinity, whereby, I think I get into it in the slide, in fact. Yes. So, as noted, comparison to weights others are using, are big motivators for one's performance. So a lot of the guys I spoke to, because my particular focus was talking about drug use and steroids, they would say I got on steroids because I saw how much weight the guys who were on steroids were lifting, and I wanted to be able to compete with them. So very much ties in. This is what I was coming towards with this idea of a strong discipline. The discipline stops them from using the drugs in an inappropriate way, because it's this idea, if you're using steroids and drinking and causing violence, that might have a negative impact on our subculture. But it also encourages this sort of belittling of anything that might be perceived as feminized. So if you're around powerlifters and say, I'm going to go and use the tanning beds because maybe you have seasonal affective disorder, that will get a very negative reaction, sort of poking fun, oh, you want to look pretty, etc. So there is this sort of underlying strain of what Anderson might term homohysteria, or this perception that you want to train for image, therefore that's feminized. So the opposite perception from the lad culture with regards to this. So I thought that was really interesting, highlighting different poles of masculinity on display. And again, as I've noted, because of this strict discipline, there's quite a conservative idea of what masculinity is. A man is someone who can lift a lot of weights and has functional ability. It's not a man who looks impressive. And you'll see this in powerlifters' physiques in terms of their body fat is much higher on average, because being ripped doesn't help you lift more weight. And I will get into cultural symbols, and we'll see from the clothing and the gym space that this is very apparent. And finally, there's this Durkheimian view of other subcultures, whereby other subcultures are seen as less because they're weaker in terms of actual physicality because of the way in which they train. So powerlifters see themselves higher in the masculine hierarchy, therefore they're not going to take advice from somebody from a rival subculture. And I've suggested this might be what could be seen in an orthodox view as a sort of masculine stubbornness. Again, a trait that ties in with perceptions of masculinity in subcultures. So really briefly, I didn't speak to many women in the course of research, but it is just interesting to note the position of women relative to these subcultures, because again, this sort of ties in with the archetypal views of masculinity on display. So within lad culture, women are primarily seen as sexual objects, as the quotes we saw in the previous slides indicate. And this is quite evident through language choices, how they refer to women who they see in the gym, etc., the talk amongst themselves, the banter, and so on, and particularly online as well. So training is male bonding time, but at the same time, because women who are in the gym are seen as potential sexual partners, there's still some socializing, but it's not inclusion. So I wouldn't term it inclusive masculinity. And in that regard, you could argue it's a sort of orthodox perspective. Powerlifters are a bit different, because there are women who are accepted in the subcultural space who compete in powerlifting competitions and so on. But because within the powerlifting subculture, which is very male-dominated, there is this hierarchy of the strongest is the alpha male, strength ties to your position in the hierarchy. What we see is women who enter, even if they are very technically good, because women are weaker than men, we wind up with this position wherein women are seen as subordinate in this hierarchy. So you can have a position wherein you have a woman who is competitive at an international level, will come into a powerlifting gym, and men who have only competed at the local and regional level, but who lift more weight, will sort of go to give advice to them and offer to help them, when in reality, of course, the woman is at a higher level in the sport, just lifts less weight. So I thought that was interesting, this paternalistic, almost the little sister position that women occupy. Again, shows what the masculine archetype of the powerlifters are. And finally, CrossFit. I didn't explicitly research CrossFit because they have their own gyms. So I was just visiting local gyms as opposed to seeking out. So this might be an interesting additional piece of work. But women there are in an interesting position because they're both part of the competitive hierarchy, compete at the games, and are included. But there's also, if you look at social media talking about CrossFit, if you type in CrossFit online, the women very much seem to be sexualized and objectified. And obviously there's some debate to what extent is this just female emancipation versus male objectification. Are they in the position of sort of grid girls, or is this women willingly saying, no, this is what I'm comfortable with? Again, I don't have the data on that. I just noticed that and thought it was a very interesting sort of thing, and again shows the different position that women occupy in all these different subcultures. So, symbols and spaces. I think this is very interesting because the subcultural symbols and the gym spaces themselves are indicative of these masculine hierarchies in these different subcultures. So I don't have much time, but very quickly I wanted to touch on clothing choices, gym layout, and changing rooms lastly. So in terms of clothing, we can see the powerlifters, because they have this idea of appearance is feminine, they signal with their clothing, so ironically using their image, to say that we don't care about image. So we have the example of the powerlifter pre and post-training walking around in a hoodie covering his muscle mass because he doesn't want to be seen as trying to show off his muscles. And then when he's actually training, we see he's wearing shorts because they're functional, because he doesn't want to be restricted wearing trousers. But for example, CrossFit, Olympic weightlifting, they'll wear tights instead. Powerlifters, you won't tend to see wearing that because it's considered too revealing, it's too image-oriented. And we can contrast this with workout culture, which has as its subsets groups such as lab culture, and also amateur bodybuilders, wherein, because in their conception big muscles are masculine, showing off big muscles is therefore a sign of masculine dominance. So they'll wear more of this sort of thing in the gym. You see the open sides on the string vest, so he's showing off more or less his whole physique, showing off the arms and the body, whereas the powerlifter, as we saw, has a t-shirt with sleeves. So very stark contrast, again, shows this very different conception of what it is to be masculine within these subcultures. And I've just noted there is potentially a sexual element to this, in that because they're putting the photos online, maybe these photos are used to try and attract women. But it does largely seem to be, for homosocial comparisons, it seems to be men who are talking about one another in the gym. And there's quotes about them comparing each other's, oh, he's got small calves, he's got small deltoids, etc. Which again, you wouldn't see in powerlifting circles because it would be considered unmasculine to do so. So gym space, there are two kinds of gyms really, hardcore and commercial. And what we find is these hardcore gyms are very much catered to just the actual function of training. So as we can see, we just have these bare bones squat racks, a lot of weights lying around on the floor. There's not really much room for socializing. It's not very polished, it's all rugged. So again, plays into this idea of the orthodox conception of the masculine. Or a good example would be if you watch the Rocky films. Rocky 4 is a great example of Rocky just trains in a barn. So that's what a real man would do. And commercial gyms show the opposite idea of masculine, in that it's all very polished, it's very aesthetic and visual focused. I don't have much time, so I will just skip on, but you can see there's a very stark contrast between the spaces which these subcultures inhabit. Lighting in commercial gyms, there's very stark downlighting when you're in a commercial gym. It's clearly catered to showing off muscles. You can just see the difference in muscular definition, very stark bicep-tricep divide versus nothing in actual light. So it's catered to gym selfies, it's catered to showing off. Whereas this is a hardcore gym, you don't have that at all. You do have mirrors, so the men can watch their form, make sure that they're lifting well, but in terms of practicing posing routines as bodybuilders do, that tends to happen at home. So very much the commercial gyms are catered to this new muscle masculinity, I suppose we could term it, adopted by that culture. And finally, I overclicked there, changing rooms. I think changing rooms are possibly the most interesting element of this. Back has this idea of live sociology, bringing sociology to life using images, and I think the changing rooms are perhaps the best representation of this. We did this quite short notice. I didn't have time to go into a hardcore gym and take a picture of the changing rooms, but this is a local commercial gym to me, and you can see it's very open plan. The showers are all open, so the men are all showering in front of one another. There's a designated drying area right in front of everybody in the changing room. And to what extent is this indicative of this masculine archetype of we are showing off, we are masculine because of our physiques, and what better way to show this than showering in front of one another and showing off in front of the changing rooms. And we see in hardcore gyms just the opposite. So I have noticed a slight caveat, this might just be the difference between commercial chains versus the local private gyms that hardcore gyms tend to be, but I don't think we can ignore this when we're talking about masculinity in gym spaces. So thank you very much for listening. Yeah, so first of all, as I noticed at the top, there is a spectrum. So perhaps even if you're in the broader workout culture, you might be distinct from the lad culture explicitly. So, but if you do identify more towards that side of the spectrum, lad culture itself, I was conducting interviewing and ethnography in gyms about 2015. Right. So it's been about 3 years, and it was broadly 16 to 24-year-olds. Mm-hmm. So perhaps it would be interesting to go back and see if those on the older end of the spectrum have moved away from that focus. But again, it's ordinarily, if we look at, say, Fiona Measham's work, where the subcultures tend to settle down as they get into relationships and have more responsibilities. I don't know the extent to which that's happening for a lot of these young men, just because I knew some who were in committed relationships at the time, but still thought, well, summer in Ibiza, it's fair game, it's not cheating because I'm on holiday. So whether that would act to inhibit the previous accruing of responsibility or maybe delay it, I'm not sure. I would assume as you get into 30s and especially towards 40s, it would drop off simply because of changing life circumstances, but I haven't actually done a deep dive in that in my own research.
And the powerlifters you came across, were they generally older?
I would say on average they were. It was qualitative ethnography, so it wasn't a huge sample size, so it's tough to make generalizations from that. So there were some who were just in their mid-20s, but I did have sort of one who had started powerlifting when he was 36, and I think he was about 38, 39 at the time he spoke. So I certainly saw more on the upper end of the age bracket. And in terms of bodybuilders who inhabit this middle position between the two, I spoke to older competitive bodybuilders in sort of their late 50s. So it does seem to be, you could still train for image, but I would expect it to transition more towards bodybuilding as opposed to the more hedonic nightclub-oriented image training. Yeah. There's a certain degree of it, but it's interesting, as I said, there's the subcultural banter element. So there might be some overt affection shown. It's always framed within a kind of banter of, oh, we're doing that, it's a bit gay. So there's a kind of dichotomy there wherein they are showing this affection, but they're almost acknowledging it and saying, but it's just banter. And then, as I noted, there is something to the sexual side of it, wherein you will get men will be involved in threesomes or they will be in these sexual situations together, but at the same time it's very much framed in a but we're not gay kind of way, which is it's an interesting.
Yeah.
Oh, certainly. So I used examples of both these subcultures and how they encourage the steroid use. I would say in lad culture and even the sort of broader, or what we're terming workout culture, there is an explicit element of, if you want to be like me, you have to use the steroids. So if I'm showing this alpha male image because I'm on social media shirtless and I'm going out to the club and attracting women, which is kind of the archetype in that group, there's an explicit message of, well, you can't be like me unless unless you're as dedicated. You've got to use these steroids if you want to be like me. In the powerlifting, it's everyone knows everyone else is on steroids, but what you tend to see is there's not that explicit message. It's, well, I saw this guy lifting all this weight and getting much faster gains, so I decided to go on to keep up. Whereas, yeah, lad culture, I used the quote there where it's like, oh, you'll never be as big as Ryan if you don't use steroids, you'll just be a little weed. So it's very explicit in the language for that subculture. But yeah, I would say on either end of the spectrum, there is encouraging of steroid use, because in both instances, steroids gets them closer to embodying that masculine archetype. So in terms of the drugs research, we tend to steer away from prohibition because pretty well within academia we're somewhat skeptical of prohibition of behaviours. So what we try and do is encourage young men, try and give them the information so that they're not hurting themselves, as opposed to simply prescribing against behaviour. Yeah. Because my focus in the research was, I did it as part of an investigation into steroid use. So my focus going in was on drugs. So I do have a single, no, tell a lie, I have 2 cases of people who use drugs for health reasons, which is interesting because, of course, steroids are harmful to health. So one was the only female respondent in the ethnography. She had hypermobility syndrome, and she had a lot of problems with her joints, was in a lot of pain, and the NHS was prescribing her opiate painkillers to deal with this. And what she did was went online and found out that human growth hormone might help her condition, and she couldn't get that on prescription, so she ordered it illicitly from China and started using it, and her ligaments repaired and she didn't have to take the opiates anymore. So that doesn't really tie in with the masculinities or the theme of this symposium, but that was a very interesting health-related case. In fact, if you type my name into YouTube, at the BSA Scottish Group Medical Sociology Conference, I spoke explicitly on this issue. So if anyone is interested in it, that would be the place to go, because I did a 15-minute presentation specifically on health.
Thank you. Wonderful. Okay, thank you very much, you two.